A question that I get asked all the time from existing podcasters as well as new podcasters alike, people who are looking to launch a podcast for the first time. They want to know how often per week should they be releasing episodes? Is once a week enough? Should I be releasing more than that? What about if I feel like I can't keep up with one a week? Is that bad? What about if I have gaps in my schedule? You know, I don't want to lose listeners, but I don't know if I have the bandwidth to keep up with once a week. That feels like a lot. And then there's people on the other end of the spectrum who are like, well, I feel like I'm in a good cadence with once a week. And should I be releasing more? Is that going to help me grow my show? These are all great questions. And I've got all the answers to these questions and more coming up for you in this episode so that you can find the best release cadence for your goals, no matter where you are on your podcasting journey. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy.
Hey Courtney, this is Ann Raju, the Peaceful Productivity Mentor, and I'm about to launch my Peaceful Productivity podcast. I have enough content to release weekly episodes at first. However, I'm concerned that maintaining a weekly schedule might be a stretch in the long run. So do you have any advice on the frequency of episodes or tips on how to manage the episode frequency without burning myself out? Thank you so much for the incredible work you do, and your insights have always been so helpful, and I truly appreciate your guidance.
And thank you so much for listening to the podcast. This is such a great question. And unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all answer, as is true in the whole of podcasting. I wish that we had cookie-cutter answers, but we don't. And that's for good reason, because no two podcasts are alike. No two businesses are alike. No two hosts are alike. And that's why the answer to this question can feel tricky for people. We get questions like this all the time from podcast hosts inside of our community, from people who attend our workshops. And these questions come in on both ends of the spectrum. To your point, is once a week enough? And what happens if I can't keep up with that? And on the flip side of that, is once a week enough? And should I be doing more? So I'm going to break down my thoughts for you no matter where you fall on this spectrum so that you can figure out what the best cadence is for you based on the goals for your podcast, which is such a key point here because there is so much podcasting advice out there. I mean, you could Google how often should I be releasing episodes, but you're going to get very cookie cutter advice, but not here. And hopefully that is why you listen to this podcast. And if you do, then you know by now that I don't dish out cookie cutter advice because no two podcasts are alike. And while some hosts might have similar goals, you know, I want to get more leads, I want to get more clients, I want to get more listeners, I want to grow my audience, I want to grow my authority. Ultimately, your business is unique, and so is your bandwidth. And all of those things play a role in finding your personal answer to this question of what should my release cadence look like? But before we break down what that should look like, let's talk about the baselines. Let's talk about why once a week minimum is so key. When I'm working with our clients inside of our pod launch community, we talk about establishing a baseline once a week. But why? Why is once a week so key? And sometimes we'll have people come in and say, well, I was planning to do seasons. Or what if I can't keep up with once a week? It feels like a lot. I mean, here I am planning all these launch episodes because I want to launch with 5 episodes or 10 episodes. But now I got to plan more to get beyond that mountain of content so that I can then keep up with a weekly release schedule and stay ahead. And that can feel like a huge mountain to climb. The reason why once a week is so important in the world of podcasting is because consistency builds a habit and a habit builds trust. Here's what I mean. There's this huge misconception floating around in the podcasting space that consistency equals growth. I don't know how it came to mean that over the years, but that's what people think. They're like, oh, I got to be consistent because that's what's going to grow my podcast. Consistency is the key to success, quote unquote, success in podcasting. No, it's not. Consistency is not the key to growth, but it is the key to helping your listeners develop and build the habit of listening to your show. And what does a habit do? A habit builds trust. And what does trust do? Trust is what leads to conversions, leads, and sales. So back in episode 282, I broke down why consistency is so important. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I definitely recommend going and listening to that because we took a deep dive into the psychology of consistency. Not because it is the thing that's going to grow your podcast, but because ultimately it's going to be the thing that keeps your listeners coming back. And this is really key because Apple and Spotify look at this data. They look to see how many unique listeners are listening to your podcast, how many are following your show, and how many are coming back again to listen again. So if you are getting into the world of podcasting and you are doing a podcast, that means you're making a commitment. I want you to think of it like a marriage, okay? Because it is that serious of a commitment. Now, I know in this day and age, a lot of people think marriage is not serious, right? But for where I come from in my upbringing, you marry one person and you stay with them for the rest of your life. And that's just that, right? It's that level of commitment. And so I want you to think of that level of commitment with your podcast going into it. If you don't have that level of commitment, then you're already setting yourself up for divorce. You're already setting yourself up for that marriage to fail, for it not to succeed. So think of it that way. And that can be really helpful when it comes to framing your mind around doing a podcast. This is not just going to be a platform that you can post to every once in a while, like you might be doing to Instagram, or like you might be doing on your email list right now, sending out an email here and there. Doing a podcast means committing to putting out content at least once a week. And in my opinion, this is the least oppressive platform for creating content, unlike YouTube that requires 7 shorts for every 20-minute video that you put out, and the 20-minute videos to be released X amount of times per week, or Instagram or TikTok that requires content all day long, every day, or even an email list where often we're told, emailing your list once a week isn't enough. You got to email twice a week, 3 times a week, daily emails, right? And it's like, holy cow, how can any one person create that much content? Podcasting is beautiful because the minimum baseline is 1 piece of good content per week. So if you are a busy person, if you are a parent, if you have a business that you're running and you just, you're going in all directions all day long, having a podcast is the best platform for you to have because it only requires 1 episode a week. So if you've picked your podcast as your primary marketing tool, congratulations, because you have just picked the least complicated way to create expert content and the most effective way, because unlike short form content that just gets buried in the newsfeed and ultimately drives 0 sales, ask me how I know, every episode that you create here on your podcast builds a library of content for you, expert content that's evergreen, that can be found at any time, and that can be listened to at any time around the world. We still have people, it blows my mind, people who listen to old episodes of the podcast, because on Spotify, you can leave comments and we'll get comments from people like, hey, this link in the show notes isn't working. And I'm like, wait, that episode was from 2019. What? Wow. So that's the upside of podcasting. The downside, the quote unquote downside, is that it requires a minimum baseline commitment. So the very first step before we can get into, okay, how do I keep up with a weekly release cadence, is to simply commit. Commit to that cadence, not for you, not for your business, but for your listeners. That's the mental shift that has to happen. When that mental shift happens and you are committing to creating a piece of content once a week to build your community, to serve your audience, to serve your listeners, the people who listen to your podcast, the second step is to then treat your podcast like a priority. This is so key. The third step from there is to then find a content creation cadence that works for you. And we're going to break this down, I promise. I'm going to give you the questions to ask yourself so you can figure out what that cadence looks like. But if your podcast is not a priority for you, it's probably because it's not yielding the ROI for you that you want, or not as much ROI as you want. And so then it's really natural to start to feel resistance around it. I mean, none of us want to do something that's not yielding ROI. I have been weightlifting for years now. And just recently, I have been in a reverse diet. And I don't like being in a reverse diet. It doesn't feel good. It's not exciting for me. It's like, okay, I'm gaining weight and I no longer see all the muscle that I have worked so hard to build. Now, I understand it's a very important part of the process, but I have reached a wall where I now feel resistance around this specific reverse diet, and where I'm talking with my nutrition coach and I'm like, I don't like how I feel. I don't want to track my macros right now. I don't want to eat as much food as I'm eating because my body and my brain, they're just not jiving. Like, I don't feel good in my skin at the moment. So we tend to build that resistance around things that are not giving us the results that we want. This is part of human nature. On the flip side, though, imagine that your podcast was bringing you new leads every week, that it was growing week over week. You got new listeners and new reviews coming in every week, new leads coming from that podcast. You would feel excited to show up. No different than if I was working out and I'm like, okay, now I'm in the opposite of a reverse diet and I'm actually cutting and I'm seeing the scale go down a little bit and I'm starting to see that muscle come through. It's like, okay, now I feel excited because I can see all the work that I have put in paying off. So it's the same with your podcast. You would feel almost this sense of obligation to show up for your listeners. You would want to show up. And the beautiful thing is, if your podcast is not yielding the ROI that you want yet, that's a very fixable problem. And if you're listening right now and you're like, yeah, that's me. I would love to help you fix it. Go to the show notes, book a call with my team, and let's find out if you're a fit for pod launch. Or if you're not quite ready for that, that's cool. I have a link in the show notes as well for a workshop that I teach where you can come hang out with me and let's talk about how to get your podcast operating where you want it to be. I will give you the framework that you need to do that. And then guess what? You're going to be a lot more excited to create. And you'll be more excited to prioritize your podcast. And here's the key, protect that time on your calendar. So, Anne, I love hearing that you have got enough content batched right now to release weekly episodes. And if we were on a call right now, or if we were talking about this in person, my next question for you would immediately be, okay, well, how many episodes is that? How many episodes do you have? How far out are you batched? And how many episodes are you launching with? Because launching with more episodes initially, when you drop multiple episodes on the day of your launch and then drive traffic to your show on the day of your launch, it's going to help increase your ranking potential because downloads and listens and new follows ultimately drive the charts. So when you launch with more episodes, the more episodes you launch with, it increases your potential to do so. But that also comes with another quote unquote downside, which is, okay, but now you've got to create content beyond the launch because you got to keep up with that cadence. And I get that that can sometimes feel a bit daunting. So I would ask you, how far out are you batched? And then based on your answer, let's just say it's 4 weeks for an easy example. Let's say you've got all your launch episodes done and you've got enough episodes to get you through the first 4 weeks of your podcast. Then I would ask you, well, what's preventing you from coming up with a batching schedule that's comfortable for you, that fits your life so that you can stay ahead? Sometimes the idea of batching in and of itself can feel like climbing a mountain, like Mount Everest. I'll never forget the weekend that I rented an Airbnb and I batched 13 weeks worth of podcast episodes. And I was burnt the you-know-what out. Not to mention that as soon as that batch ran out, I was immediately staring at the mountain of 13 more episodes that I had to climb. So while in theory, a quarterly batching schedule sounded great, didn't actually work for me in reality. So the key here is we got to find a schedule that works for you. Is it 2 weeks ahead? 4 weeks ahead? 6 weeks? I don't recommend going much farther out than 6 weeks ahead because things can change. You never know what's going to happen in life between now and 6 weeks from now. But you want to be far enough ahead that way, a sickness that might come through the house or holidays, or if you've got kids, the kids are off of school. That way those things don't interfere and you've got buffer and you're not butting up against this wall of, oh my gosh, I have an episode that needs to drop this week and I've got nothing. Then what you need to do once you figure out what that cadence looks like to stay batched, let's just say it's 2 weeks ahead. Keep it really simple. What we want to do is 2 weeks prior to that episode airing, you have got to have time scheduled on your calendar as an appointment so that nothing takes its place. So my process behind the scenes, you ready? Here's what it looks like. I spend 1 week a month batching 1 month's worth of content. I literally have an entire week on my calendar blocked off where I do not take calls. I do not teach workshops. If it ever looks like I'm ghosting on Instagram, guess what? I'm batching podcast episodes because that is where my head is focused on that level of content creation that week for the main source of content for the entirety of the business. And I am batching those episodes. For me, because we release twice a week, that's 8 episodes a month. Now for our guest interviews, we do those 1 full calendar quarter ahead of time. So that way I am recording once a calendar quarter. I block off 1 week where I batch all of our guest interviews. And that way, when I sit down to do the monthly batch of content, I have everything that I need to be able to actually create those episodes and get them in the queue. And my goal is to always be a month ahead. Does it always happen that way? No. But because I block that time off on my calendar and because I don't allow anything else to take its place, that allows me to protect that time and stay ahead. Sometimes it might look like it's just a couple of weeks ahead, depending on what's going on in life at that point. But I always aim to be ahead. So you've got to figure out what works for you and then schedule it as a recurring appointment on your calendar so everything else can fit around it. As hosts, if we are choosing and committing to a podcast as our primary platform, we've got to treat that podcast like a priority. But that said, there will be times when life happens, when you didn't get to batch your episodes, when something needs to go out this week, or you need to give yourself a buffer to catch back up. And I have some really great ways you can do this, 8 ways specifically, without creating any more work for yourself. I'm going to link to an episode in the show notes where I break down what these 8 different ways are that you can cover those weekly episodes when you've got nothing batched so that you can keep that weekly cadence and you don't risk losing the listener trust that you have been working so hard to build, but that can also buy you some time to catch back up if and when life happens. But what about on the flip side of this spectrum? What if you have your weekly cadence dialed in? Things are going well. You've found your rhythm, but okay, now I want more growth with the podcast. And so right now you might be thinking, well, is once a week enough? Should I be doing more? This is an inevitable question that every podcaster asks when they reach a certain point in their journey. And it's a totally valid question. I asked myself this too. And guess what? I tested it out. And guess what? I found that increasing output does not necessarily translate to more listeners unless you have specific things dialed in first. So my first question for you is, number one, is your podcast bringing in the leads and sales that you want? If the answer is no, then my second follow-up question to that is, are you looking to grow your podcast audience because you believe that a bigger audience will help you bring in more sales and more leads? And if the answer is yes, then my question is, well, if the audience you have right now isn't buying, what makes you think a bigger one will? Because right now, if your podcast is not bringing in the leads or the sales that you want, you have a conversion problem. You don't have a growth problem. You can't fix a conversion problem with growth because ultimately you'll just wind up with a bigger audience who doesn't buy. So what we want to do is we want to fix the conversion problem first, and then you can send all the traffic you want to your podcast to grow your audience. And you should see that conversion also increase over time as your audience grows. So if you want more downloads and listens, the first step is not to increase your output. The first step is to make sure you're optimizing what you're already doing so that you're not adding more to your plate if what you're doing isn't working. Then once you're seeing that week over week percentage of growth increase and you're calculating that, how many listens did I get last week? How many listens did I get this week? And what was that percentage increase or decrease? We want to see that increasing week over week. When you're seeing that consistently for 90 days, then that's when we consider adding in a strategy like increasing your output, i.e., how many episodes you're releasing a week, if you have the bandwidth. Because you might not have the bandwidth, and if you don't, that's okay too, because then there's other strategies we can put in place to drive traffic to your show. Because increasing output might help more of your existing listeners listen to more episodes, but it's not going to necessarily get more listeners listening to your podcast. And that's a very important distinction. So, same thing here. If you reach a point where you do decide you want to increase your output, you want to prioritize the podcast, you want to block that time off on your calendar and protect that time. But what I would encourage you to think about before you make that leap is, first of all, let's make sure your podcast is converting. Let's make sure you're seeing that week over week growth percentage increase for at least steadily 3 months or more. And then let's figure out your bandwidth. And let's see, is the actual goal here to get more of your existing listeners, your warm audience listening to more episodes? Or is it to increase more new listeners and actually grow the audience of your podcast? So, Anne, I appreciate this question so much because there's a lot to consider. And I appreciate that you took the time to record this and to send this in. And I hope that these questions are helpful for you and that your answers, when you sit down, this is my challenge for you. If you're listening right now, no matter where you are in your podcasting journey, if you're looking to increase output, or if you are looking to just figure out how you can keep up with once a week minimum, because now you understand how and why that's so important, that you spend 10 minutes after you listen to this episode, over 10 minutes in the next 24 hours. Let's make it very specific. Go spend 10 minutes answering these questions, and those answers are going to give you the clear steps that you need to take when it comes to deciding the best release cadence for your podcast, because ultimately, it's going to come down to what you value. If you are podcasting because deep down it's an ego play. Now, look, I know when I say that, you might get offended, but for me in the beginning of my podcast, it was an ego play. I wanted a bigger audience. I wanted to have millions of followers. I wanted people to be hanging on my every word. And it wasn't in genuine service to my listeners. But when you can make that mental shift and actually show up in service to your listeners and really put your listeners first, guess what? Ultimately, over the long run, you will see the growth that you want to see with your podcast. There are things we could do to accelerate that growth, sure. But really, at the end of the day, podcasting comes down to your commitment to your listeners, because that's what's going to build their trust in you. And that trust is a prerequisite for leads. So treat your podcast like a priority. Have a backup plan when things don't go according to plan. Expect that things won't go according to plan. Protect that time on your calendar and figure out how many weeks you need to stay ahead. If it's 2 weeks, great. If it's 4 weeks, great. If you can do more, fine. And then if you're considering increasing output to grow your audience, first, make sure what you're doing is already working like you want it to before you commit to adding anything else to your plate. And speaking of bandwidth, in the next episode, I've got a very special guest and YouTube expert joining us to talk about the pros and cons of getting on YouTube with your podcast. It is all the rage right now, and you hear a lot of people talking about the upsides and the opportunity. But usually when someone is only talking about the upsides and not the reality of what the commitment to that platform actually entails, they're trying to sell you something. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to sit down and we're going to give you everything that you need to consider so you can make the best and most informed decision for your podcast based on your goals. So if you've been hearing about YouTube and you've been wondering, well, should I start building a channel for my podcast? Am I missing out if I'm not on YouTube? Gosh, am I really missing out on all this searchability and potential of, listeners and followers and viewers and revenue and all the things that people are trying to sell you on right now? Or if you are already on YouTube, but you're not getting the views and the engagement that you want, then stick around because all that's coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.